The black Bentley looked wrong parked outside Rosie's Diner in Newark, New Jersey, a sleek predator among the battered pickup trucks. 3 lawyers in Armani suits stepped out, followed by an old man Grace recognized immediately. Franklin Westbrook, the homeless man she'd been feeding for free these past 2 years. But now he wore an expensive suit, carrying that weathered wooden box he'd always clutched on cold nights. Grace felt her heart pound as he entered, his familiar gentle eyes now sharp with purpose and determination. "Hello, Grace," he said. "It's time you knew the truth." The morning rush at Rosie's Diner always started at 5:30 sharp, when the construction workers grabbed coffee before their shifts at the Newark waterfront development. Grace Caldwell had perfected the rhythm over 3 years. 2 eggs over easy for Tommy Martinez, black coffee and wheat toast for the Johnson brothers, scrambled with bacon for old Pete, who'd been coming here since the 1970s. She moved between tables with practiced ease, her worn sneakers silent on the checkered linoleum floor, but her mind kept drifting to the stack of medical bills hidden in her locker. Newark Beth Israel Medical Center had been sending notices about her mother's outstanding balance for chemotherapy treatments, each envelope thicker than the last. Michael had offered to take a semester off from Princeton to help, but Grace had forbidden it. Their family had sacrificed too much already for him to throw away his chance at a real future. The bell above the door chimed, and Grace glanced up from the coffee pot to see Franklin Westbrook shuffling in, his threadbare army jacket hanging loose on his thin frame. He clutched that old oak box against his chest like always, the letters FW 1962, barely visible beneath decades of wear. Joe Martinelli, the diner's owner, had made the rules clear. No handouts, no exceptions, bad for business in a neighborhood already struggling. But something about Franklin had caught Grace's attention from his first appearance 2 years ago. Maybe it was the way he carefully folded his Financial Times newspapers salvaged from the recycling bin, or how he filled that leather notebook with neat rows of numbers while nursing a single cup of coffee for hours. She'd started slipping him extra food when Joe wasn't looking, a sandwich here, a bowl of soup there, always with a gentle smile that asked for nothing in return. Franklin settled into his usual corner booth, the one beneath the flickering fluorescent light that Joe kept meaning to fix. Grace brought him coffee without being asked, noticing how his fingers trembled slightly as he wrapped them around the warm mug. "Cold morning out there," she said softly, already mentally calculating if she could spare a full breakfast from her employee meal allowance. Franklin looked up at her with those pale blue eyes that seemed to hold depths she couldn't quite fathom. "You're very kind, Grace," he murmured, his voice carrying an oddly formal cadence. "Kindness like yours is increasingly rare in this world." He opened his notebook and began writing, the morning sun casting long shadows across the pages. Through the window, Grace noticed a black sedan parked across Broad Street, its tinted windows reflecting the early morning light. She'd seen it before, always when Franklin was here, always with the engine running. Once, she'd mentioned it to Franklin, worried someone might be following him, but he'd simply smiled and said some guardian angels preferred German engineering. The comment had puzzled her. Homeless men didn't usually make jokes about BMW sedans. But then Franklin was full of small mysteries. The way he could calculate tips in his head faster than the register. How he knew the stock prices for companies she'd never heard of. The faded tattoo on his forearm that spelled out 82nd Airborne in military script. The breakfast rush picked up, and Grace lost herself in the familiar chaos of orders and refills. But she kept glancing at Franklin's corner, watching him work through his papers with an intensity that seemed at odds with his circumstances. Once, she caught him staring at a photo in that wooden box, his weathered face softening with a grief so profound it made her chest tight. He'd whispered a name, Margaret, before closing the box with gentle reverence. Later, as she cleared nearby tables, she heard him mutter something about Sterling Industries in his sleep, his head resting against the window. The name meant nothing to her then, just another fragment of a broken man's dreams. By noon, Franklin had finished his 3rd cup of coffee and the turkey sandwich Grace had smuggled him. He left exact change on the table, never a penny more or less, and gave her that formal little nod he always did. "Until tomorrow, Miss Caldwell," he said, hefting his box and shuffling toward the door. Grace watched him go, wondering not for the first time what story lay behind those careful manners in that mysterious wooden box. The black sedan pulled away from the curb moments after Franklin turned the corner, its departure as silent and purposeful as its vigil. She shook her head and got back to work, never imagining that in just 3 days, her simple acts of kindness would unlock a $40 billion secret and change 5,000 lives forever. Monday morning arrived with spring rain that turned Newark's streets into rivers of gray water and floating garbage. Grace had worked a double shift the night before, covering for Maria, who'd called in sick again, and her feet screamed in protest as she climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment above the Vietnamese grocery store. The mailbox was stuffed with the usual collection of bills and flyers, but a cream-colored envelope caught her attention immediately. The return address read Hartley, Pemberton and Associates, with a Manhattan address that might as well have been on another planet from her working-class neighborhood. Grace's hand trembled slightly as she tore it open, wondering if this was some new collection agency her mother's hospital had hired. The letter inside was printed on paper so thick it felt like fabric between her fingers. "Dear Ms. Caldwell," it began in elegant typeface. "You have been identified as a crucial witness in the matter of Westbrook versus Sterling Industries regarding systematic pension fraud affecting over 5,000 employees. Your presence is respectfully requested at our offices to discuss your role in documenting essential evidence. A car will arrive at your residence at 9 a.m. Tuesday should you choose to participate. Your cooperation could help restore $1.3 billion to families who have lost their retirement security." Grace read the letter 3 times, certain she was misunderstanding something. The only Westbrook she knew was Franklin, and he certainly wasn't suing anyone from his corner booth at Rosie's. She called the number on the letterhead, half expecting it to be disconnected or some elaborate scam. Instead, a professional voice answered on the first ring. "Hartley, Pemberton and Associates. How may I direct your call?" When Grace stammered out her name, the receptionist's tone warmed noticeably. "Ms. Caldwell, yes, we've been hoping to hear from you. Ms. Pemberton asked me to clear her schedule the moment you called. Can you hold for just 1 moment?" Before Grace could respond, classical music filled the line. 30 seconds later, a different voice came on, authoritative yet somehow reassuring. "Ms. Caldwell, this is Victoria Pemberton. I apologize for the mysterious nature of our correspondence, but I assure you this is quite real and extremely important. May I ask, do you know a man named Franklin Westbrook?" Grace sank onto her second-hand couch, her mind racing. "The homeless gentleman? I serve him breakfast most mornings at the diner." There was a pause on the other end, then something that might have been a sad chuckle. "Ms. Caldwell, Franklin Westbrook is many things, but homeless isn't one of them. He's the former chief financial officer of Sterling Industries, one of the largest manufacturing conglomerates in the country. For the past 2 years, he's been conducting, let's call it an investigation, and you, without knowing it, have been instrumental in documenting his findings." Grace's coffee mug slipped from numb fingers, spreading a brown stain across her carpet. "I don't understand," she whispered. Victoria's voice gentled. "I know this is shocking, but Franklin has kept meticulous records of your kindness, your observations, your character. He believes, and I agree, that your testimony about the human cost of corporate greed could be the key to justice for thousands of families. Will you come?" Tuesday morning found Grace standing outside her apartment building in her only business outfit, a black skirt suit she'd bought for her father's funeral 5 years ago. The car that pulled up wasn't the yellow cab she'd expected, but a black town car with a uniformed driver who opened her door with practiced deference. "1 Wall Street, correct, Ms. Caldwell?" he asked, and Grace could only nod, feeling like she'd stepped through some invisible barrier into another world. The ride through the Holland Tunnel and into Manhattan passed in a blur of rain-slicked windows and impossibly tall buildings. She'd been to the city before, of course, but always as a tourist or for hospital appointments with her mother. This felt different, purposeful, consequential. slightly terrifying. The offices of Hartley, Pemberton and Associates occupied the entire 47th floor of a glass tower that scraped the cloudy sky. Grace's sneakers squeaked on marble floors that reflected the crystal chandeliers overhead. Everyone moved with urgent purpose, from the security guards who checked her ID to the assistants gliding between offices with armloads of documents. Victoria Pemberton met her personally at the elevator, a woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and eyes that missed nothing. "Ms. Caldwell, thank you for coming. Before we go any further, I need you to understand that everything you're about to learn is protected by attorney-client privilege. You're not our client, technically, but Franklin has insisted you be given the same protections. Do you understand?" Grace nodded, though she wasn't sure she understood anything anymore. Victoria led her to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the rain-swept city. Franklin was already there, but Grace almost didn't recognize him. Gone was the threadbare army jacket and worn shoes. In their place was a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than she made in 6 months. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. But it was his eyes that had changed the most, no longer vague and distant, but sharp as surgical instruments. He stood when she entered, that same formal courtesy she'd seen 1,000 times at the diner. But now it made sense. This was a man who'd spent decades in boardrooms exactly like this one. "Grace," he said simply, "I owe you an explanation." The explanation, when it came, felt like watching a movie about someone else's life. Franklin had spent 38 years at Sterling Industries, rising from junior accountant to CFO, helping build the company from a small New Jersey manufacturer into a multinational corporation. He'd managed their pension fund, ensuring that every worker from the factory floor to middle management had secure retirement waiting. Then, in 2015, the founder's son Bradley Sterling had taken over as CEO, bringing with him new ideas about maximizing shareholder value and streamlining redundancies. Franklin had noticed discrepancies almost immediately. Consulting fees paid to companies that seemed to exist only on paper, investment returns that didn't match market performance, pension payouts quietly reduced without explanation. When he'd raised concerns, Bradley had assured him everything was legitimate, just creative accounting to stay competitive. By 2017, Franklin knew he was looking at systematic fraud on a massive scale. Over $1 billion had been siphoned from the pension fund through a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts. When he'd confronted Bradley with evidence, threatening to go to the authorities, things had turned ugly fast. Suddenly, there were whispers about Franklin's declining mental capacity, suggestions that he'd been embezzling funds himself. The board of directors, stacked with Bradley's allies, had given him a choice: resign quietly with a generous severance package and a non-disclosure agreement, or face criminal charges based on fabricated evidence. Franklin had taken a third option that no one had expected. He'd resigned, yes, but instead of disappearing quietly, he'd gone underground. For 2 years, he'd watched and waited, gathering evidence the authorities would need to unravel the conspiracy. But more importantly, he'd wanted to document the human cost of Bradley's greed. The retired workers losing their homes, the families destroyed by poverty that shouldn't exist, the quiet desperation of people who'd given their lives to a company that had betrayed them. That's where Grace came in. "You see," Franklin said, gesturing to a stack of journals on the conference table, "I needed someone who could bear witness to what corporate malfeasance really means. Not numbers on a spreadsheet, but real human suffering. Every morning you told me stories about your customers. Workers from the Sterling factory worried about their futures. Retirees counting pennies to afford breakfast. Families torn apart by financial stress they didn't create. You showed me kindness when you thought I had nothing to offer in return. That's the kind of integrity Bradley Sterling can't understand and can't fight against." He opened the wooden box she'd seen him carry so many times, but instead of personal mementos, it contained a small USB drive. 40 gigabytes of financial records, emails, and transaction histories. Everything needed to prove how they stole from 5,000 families. But prosecutors need more than numbers. They need a story. They need someone like you to make the jury understand what those numbers mean in human terms. Grace felt the room spin slightly. But I'm just a waitress. I don't know anything about financial fraud or courtrooms or any of this. Victoria leaned forward, her expression intense, but not unkind. That's exactly why we need you. You're credible because you're real. You helped Franklin not because you knew he was wealthy or powerful, but because it was the right thing to do. You've witnessed the effects of this crime every day in your diner without even knowing it. Your testimony, combined with Franklin's evidence, could be the key to the largest pension fraud recovery in New Jersey history. Franklin reached across the table, his weathered hand covering Grace's. I'm asking a lot. I know. This won't be easy. Bradley Sterling has resources and lawyers and connections. He'll try to discredit both of us. But Grace, those people who come into your diner every morning, they deserve justice. Their children deserve the futures their parents worked for. Will you help me give them that? Grace thought about her mother's medical bills, about Michael studying late into the night at Princeton, about all the customers who'd grown grayer and more worried over the past 2 years without understanding why their promised retirements were evaporating. She thought about Franklin sitting in his corner booth, playing the role of a broken man while carrying the weight of 5,000 families' futures in a wooden box. She took a deep breath and squeezed his hand in return. Tell me what you need me to do. The smile that crossed Franklin's face was like sunrise after a long, dark night. Victoria began pulling documents from her briefcase, and outside the windows, the rain finally stopped falling. Grace Caldwell, waitress from Newark, was about to enter a war where the weapons were spreadsheets and testimonies, where the battlefield was courtrooms and boardrooms, and where the stakes were nothing less than justice itself. She'd thought her small acts of kindness didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. She was about to learn how wrong she'd been. The Sterling Industries headquarters in Jersey City rose from the industrial landscape like a glass and steel declaration of dominance. Grace pressed her visitor badge against the turnstile, still not quite believing she was walking into a 40-story building as a corporate culture consultant. Victoria Pemberton's carefully crafted cover story that would give her access to observe the company's inner workings. Her escort, a young HR representative named Ashley, chatted nervously about the company's exciting restructuring initiatives as they rode the elevator past floors of cubicles and conference rooms. Grace nodded and smiled, playing the role of an eager consultant, while her eyes cataloged everything: the expensive art in the hallways, the employees who hurried past with downcast eyes, the way conversation died whenever someone in an expensive suit appeared. Franklin had coached her for 3 days in Victoria's conference room, teaching her what to look for beneath Sterling's polished surface. Companies that commit fraud always leave traces, he'd explained, spreading organizational charts across the table like battle plans. Watch for locked doors in open-plan offices, meetings that aren't on official calendars, executives who seem nervous around certain topics. Most importantly, find the people who've been there long enough to remember when things were different. They're usually the ones who know where the bodies are buried. Now, walking through Sterling's 10th floor benefits department, Grace understood what he meant. The cubicles were filled with middle-aged workers hunched over computers, processing pension claims with the defeated air of people who knew they were administering bad news. Ashley deposited her in a small conference room with a view of the Newark Bay, promising someone would be along shortly to begin her cultural assessment. Grace pulled out the leather portfolio Victoria had given her, trying to look professional while her heart hammered against her ribs. Through the glass walls, she watched the benefits department go about their business. Phone calls with crying retirees, stacks of claim denials, supervisors huddled over computer screens with worried expressions. A woman in her 60s walked past, stopped, then backed up to stare at Grace through the glass. After a moment's hesitation, she knocked and entered without waiting for permission. "You're the consultant they hired to figure out why morale is in the toilet?" she asked bluntly. Grace recognized the type immediately, the office veteran who'd outlasted multiple management changes and had nothing left to lose. "Something like that," Grace replied carefully. "I'm Grace Caldwell." "And you are?" The woman snorted. "Eleanor Bradshaw. I was Franklin Westbrook's assistant for 20 years, back when this company still had a soul. Now I process denial letters for people I've known since they were kids in the factory daycare. You want to know what's wrong with Sterling's culture? We used to build things that lasted. Now we build Excel sheets that make rich people richer, while the folks who actually work get their futures stolen 1 percentage point at a time. She glanced around, checking for eavesdroppers, then leaned closer. You seem different from the other consultants Bradley brings in. Less shiny, more human. You actually want to hear the truth? Or are you just here to rubber stamp whatever story they're selling? Grace made a decision that Franklin had warned her she'd have to make. Whether to trust someone inside Sterling who might help or might expose her real purpose. I want to understand what's really happening here, she said quietly. The real story, not the corporate version. Eleanor studied her for a long moment, then pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. Honey, the real story would curl your hair. But let me start with something simple. You see that locked conference room on the 47th floor? The one with the key card reader that only C-suite badges can open? That's where the real decisions get made, not the stuff in board minutes or shareholder reports. The decisions about which retirees get their claims lost when the fund runs low, which vendors get million-dollar contracts for services that never quite materialize. Over the next hour, Eleanor painted a picture of Sterling Industries that made Grace's stomach turn. The company employed over 5,000 people across 3 states, managing a pension fund worth $8.2 billion. Or at least that's what the official reports claimed. But Eleanor had noticed patterns in her 20 years of processing paperwork. Consulting firms that billed millions but never seemed to produce actual reports. Investment strategies that consistently underperformed the market yet generated huge management fees. Retirees whose cost of living adjustments mysteriously vanished into administrative corrections. And always the trail led back to that locked room on the 47th floor where Bradley Sterling held meetings that didn't appear on any official calendar. Franklin tried to stop it, Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a whisper. He'd stay late, going through records, asking questions that made Bradley nervous. Then suddenly there were rumors about Franklin's mental state, suggestions that he'd been siphoning money himself. Complete bull, of course. Franklin Westbrook was the most honest man I've ever known. But when you control the narrative, you can make anyone look guilty. After they forced him out, Bradley promoted Margaret Sinclair to CFO. Nice woman, competent, but she does what she's told and doesn't ask inconvenient questions. That's what passes for leadership here now. She pulled out her phone, showing Grace a photo of the old Sterling Industries annual picnic. Thousands of employees and their families gathered in Liberty State Park, Franklin at the center of it all with his late wife Margaret, both of them beaming. This was what we used to be. A family company that took care of its own. Now look at us. Grace spent the rest of the day moving through Sterling's departments with Ashley, taking notes on corporate culture while actually documenting the human wreckage of financial fraud. In accounting, she met a young analyst who discovered discrepancies in vendor payments but had been told to focus on tasks within your pay grade. In human resources, she found files full of early retirement offers that weren't quite voluntary, all targeting employees who'd asked too many questions. But it was in the executive dining room that she struck gold. While pretending to assess the cultural messaging of corporate spaces, she overheard 2 senior vice presidents discussing Project Prometheus in hushed tones. One of them mentioned that Connor Ashford would be flying in from the Cayman Islands next week for a phase review, and that Bradley wanted all Prometheus documentation moved to the secure server before his arrival. That evening, Grace met Franklin and Victoria at a small restaurant in Hoboken, far enough from Sterling's headquarters to avoid accidental encounters. She spread her notes across the table like pieces of a complex puzzle. Project Prometheus appears to be the code name for the entire embezzlement operation, she explained, still amazed at how much she'd learned in a single day. I've identified at least 6 shell companies that exist only as names on invoices. Prometheus Capital Advisors, Prometheus Risk Management, Prometheus Strategic Solutions, and 3 others. They all bill Sterling for consulting services, but Eleanor says no one has ever met a consultant from any of them. The addresses are all private mailbox services in Delaware. Franklin nodded grimly, adding her findings to his ever-growing documentation. Classic shell game. Create fake companies, bill for fake services, move the money offshore before anyone notices. Simple and effective if you control the approval process. Victoria was already on her laptop, searching corporate registrations. All 6 companies were incorporated by the same law firm in Wilmington, all on the same day in March 2015, right after Bradley became CEO. The registered agent is a company that specializes in anonymous incorporations. But here's the interesting part. The bank accounts all trace back to a single financial institution in Georgetown, Grand Cayman. Guess who sits on that bank's advisory board? She turned the screen toward them, revealing a photo of Connor Ashford at a banking conference, identified as Senior Advisor, Cayman International Holdings. Grace felt the pieces clicking together. So Bradley and Connor are running this together, using Sterling's pension fund as their personal piggy bank while thousands of employees lose their retirement security. The question now, Franklin said quietly, is how we prove it in a way that even Bradley's expensive lawyers can't explain away. We need a paper trail showing the money moving from Sterling's accounts through the shells to the Cayman accounts. We need communications between Bradley and Connor discussing the scheme. And we need to show intent, that they knew they were stealing from the pension fund, not just making bad investment decisions. He looked at Grace with something almost like pride. You did exceptionally well today. Eleanor Bradshaw wouldn't have opened up to just anyone. You have a gift for making people trust you, for seeing past the corporate facade to the human truth underneath. That's going to be crucial in the days ahead. Grace thought about Eleanor's bitter laugh when she described processing denial letters for people she'd watched grow up, about the young analyst afraid to report fraud for fear of losing his job, about the thousands of Sterling employees and retirees who had no idea their futures were being systematically stolen by men in expensive suits holding secret meetings in locked rooms. I want to go back, she said firmly. There's more to find. And Eleanor offered to show me some interesting filing systems that might have been overlooked during the transition. She also mentioned that Janet Morrison in IT might be sympathetic. Apparently she's been asking why certain servers are restricted access even from senior IT staff. Victoria and Franklin exchanged glances. It could be dangerous, Victoria warned. If Bradley suspects you're more than just a consultant, but Grace was already thinking ahead, planning her next moves like Franklin had taught her. He won't suspect anything. I'm just a waitress from Newark doing a cultural assessment. What could I possibly know about international financial fraud? The smile that crossed her face would have worried Bradley Sterling tremendously if he'd seen it. Because Grace Caldwell was learning that sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption wasn't a law degree or a forensic accounting certification. Sometimes it was just being underestimated by men who thought their money and power made them untouchable. Tomorrow, she'd go back to Sterling Industries, armed with nothing but a notebook and the trust of employees who'd been waiting years for someone to finally listen to their stories. And piece by piece, document by document, she'd help Franklin build a case that would bring Bradley Sterling's empire crashing down around his handmade Italian shoes. The War Room, as Victoria Pemberton had started calling it, occupied a secure conference room in her law firm's Manhattan offices. Every surface was covered with documents, financial statements, and charts that mapped the flow of Sterling Industries pension funds like a corrupted circulatory system. Grace arrived at 7 a.m. on Saturday, finding Franklin already there with 2 forensic accountants who looked like they hadn't slept in days. Morning, Grace, Franklin said without looking up from a spreadsheet. Coffee's fresh, and we're about to crack open the 2017 third quarter reports. That's when the Prometheus payments really accelerated. She poured herself a cup and joined them at the table, still amazed at how natural this felt after just 2 weeks of investigation. The forensic accountants, introduced as David Chen and Sarah Martinez, had been hired by Victoria's firm specifically for this case. They specialized in unraveling complex financial fraud, and their excitement was palpable as they walked Grace through their findings. Look at this pattern, David said, pulling up a visualization on his laptop. Every quarter, Right before Sterling has to report its pension fund status, there's a flurry of payments to the Prometheus shell companies. The amounts vary, 50 million here, 75 million there, but they're always disguised as investment advisory fees or risk management consulting. The timing isn't coincidental. They're draining the fund just enough to stay under regulatory radar while maximizing their theft. Sarah added her analysis, her fingers flying across her keyboard. What's brilliant and despicable about this scheme is how they've layered it. The money goes from Sterling to the shells, but then it splits into dozens of smaller transactions. Some goes to fake invoices for services never rendered. Some gets categorized as failed investments in companies that barely exist. But we've traced at least 60% of it to accounts in the Cayman Islands controlled by a company called Ashford Holdings. 3 guesses who owns that. Grace felt her anger building as the scope became clearer. This wasn't just white-collar crime. It was the systematic destruction of thousands of lives, executed with spreadsheets instead of weapons. Franklin pulled out a thick folder of printed emails, all carefully annotated in his precise handwriting. These are from my personal archive, messages I saved before they forced me out. Bradley was always careful in his official communications, but he got sloppy in what he thought were private exchanges. Here's one from October 2017, where he tells Connor Ashford to accelerate Prometheus Phase 2 before the auditors arrive. And this one from December, where he jokes about pension tension and says, what they don't know won't hurt their golden years. The casual cruelty in those words made Grace think of her regular customers at Rosie's, construction workers whose hands were too damaged for more labor, counting on those pensions to survive. "Can we use these in court?" she asked. Victoria nodded. Franklin retrieved them while he was still CFO, so they're legally obtained. But we need more. We need to show the full scope of the conspiracy. Grace pulled out her own contribution. Photos she'd taken with her phone during her visits to Sterling Industries. "Eleanor Bradshaw helped me access some interesting records," she said, spreading the images across the table. "These are approval signatures for the Prometheus payments. Look closely at the dates and times." David leaned in, then whistled softly. "Holy shit. Sorry, but these were all approved in batches at 3 a.m. on Sundays. No legitimate business happens at 3 a.m. on a Sunday. This screams automated fraud, probably set up to process when no one would notice." Grace smiled. That's what Eleanor thought too. She also gave me this. She produced a USB drive that Eleanor had slipped her during their last meeting. She's been keeping copies of certain transactions that didn't feel right, 20 years of instincts telling her something was wrong. Victoria immediately handed the drive to her IT security specialist, who'd been called in specifically to ensure any digital evidence was preserved correctly. "We'll need to verify the chain of custody, but if this contains what I think it does..." She trailed off as the specialist's eyes widened. "Ma'am, there are hundreds of files here. Payment authorizations, board meeting minutes that were supposedly destroyed, even security footage from the executive floor." Franklin stood up slowly, his face showing a mix of vindication and sorrow. "Eleanor always was thorough. I should have trusted her with my suspicions earlier. Maybe we could have stopped this before it got so bad." The team worked through the afternoon, building their case document by document. Grace found herself increasingly valuable as the only one who could provide context for the human impact. "This denial letter here," she said, pointing to one of Eleanor's saved files. "I know this family. Maria Santos. Her husband worked at Sterling for 30 years. They were counting on his pension to pay for their daughter's college. Now she's working 3 jobs and might have to drop out." Every number in the spreadsheets had a face, a story, a family destroyed by Bradley Sterling's greed. Grace made sure the lawyers understood that, made sure they felt it the way she did every morning at the diner. By 5 p.m., they'd constructed a clear timeline covering 3 years of systematic fraud. The pattern was undeniable. Sterling Industries had stolen approximately $1.3 billion from its pension fund through a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts. The money had been used to inflate executive bonuses, fund Bradley's lavish lifestyle, and presumably line Connor Ashford's pockets for his cooperation. "We have enough for criminal charges," Victoria announced. "But I want to give them one chance to make this right before we involve the FBI. If we can recover the stolen funds without a prolonged legal battle, the employees get their money back faster." Grace was studying a particular set of transactions when something caught her eye. "Wait a minute. Look at these payments to someone named Blake Donovan. They don't follow the Prometheus pattern, but they're huge. 5 million here, 10 million there, all categorized as special consulting fees." "Who is Blake Donovan?" Franklin frowned. "The name's familiar. He was at some executive retreats, but I was never clear on his role. Bradley always introduced him as a strategic advisor, but he seemed more interested in sailing than strategy." Sarah was already searching. "Blake Donovan, age 35, official residence in Scarsdale, but owns properties in Miami, Aspen, and... Hello? What's this? A $50 million estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, purchased 2 years ago. That's a lot of house for a strategic advisor." David pulled up social media profiles, his expression growing more incredulous. "Guys, look at this. Blake Donovan's Instagram is full of photos with Bradley Sterling. Vacations in St. Bart's, skiing in Gstaad, yacht parties in Monaco. These aren't business trips. And look at the comments. They're using pet names for each other." The room went silent as the implications sank in. Victoria was the first to speak. "If Bradley Sterling is funneling pension fund money to his romantic partner, that's not just fraud. It's a breach of fiduciary duty that no board of directors can ignore. This is the leverage we've been looking for." Grace felt a mix of triumph and disgust. "So while retirees are losing their homes, Bradley's buying his boyfriend a $50 million mansion with their money?" Franklin's voice was cold as winter steel. "It appears so. And that explains why Connor Ashford was willing to help. He's not just a co-conspirator, he's facilitating a love affair funded by stolen pensions. The board might tolerate financial creativity, but they won't tolerate this kind of personal corruption. Not when it becomes public." The weight of what they'd uncovered settled over the room like a heavy blanket. As the team began planning their next moves, Grace thought about the trust people placed in institutions like Sterling Industries. Workers who'd given decades of their lives, believing their futures were secure. They'd never imagined that their CEO would treat their retirement funds like a personal ATM for romantic getaways and mansion purchases. "How much can we recover?" she asked Victoria. "If Bradley agrees to our terms, how much can we get back?" Victoria's expression was determined. "All of it, every penny. We'll freeze every account, seize every asset, claw back every bonus. Blake Donovan's houses, Connor's offshore holdings, Bradley's art collection, all of it goes back to the pension fund. These people thought they were untouchable because they were rich and powerful. They're about to learn that math doesn't care about your net worth. The numbers don't lie, and neither will we." Franklin stood at the window, looking out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. "You know what the real tragedy is? Sterling Industries was a good company once. We made products that mattered, took care of our people, built something lasting. Bradley inherited all of that and decided it wasn't enough. He wanted more, always more, and he was willing to destroy 5,000 families to get it." He turned back to the team, his eyes hard with resolve. "On Monday, we give him one chance to make this right. One chance to return what he stole and face the consequences. If he refuses..." He didn't need to finish. They all knew what came next. Criminal charges, public exposure, and the complete destruction of Bradley Sterling's carefully constructed world. Grace gathered her copies of the evidence, thinking about the conversation she'd have to have with Eleanor Bradshaw. The woman who'd risked her job to provide crucial evidence deserved to know that her courage hadn't been wasted. Tomorrow was Sunday, and Grace would work her regular shift at Rosie's Diner, serving coffee to people whose futures hung in the balance of their investigation. But Monday, the war against Sterling Industries would enter its final phase, and Grace Caldwell, waitress from Newark, would be standing right in the center of it, armed with truth and ready for battle. The Sterling Industries boardroom occupied the entire northeast corner of the 47th floor, its windows offering panoramic views of Manhattan's skyline. Grace tried not to gape as she followed Franklin and Victoria's legal team into the space, her sensible flats silent on carpet that probably cost more than her annual salary. The mahogany table could have seated 30, but today only a dozen chairs were occupied. Bradley Sterling sat at the head, his Armani suit impeccable, his expression carefully neutral. The silver fox at his right had to be Connor Ashford. Grace recognized the calculating eyes from the banking conference photos. The current CFO, Margaret Sinclair, fidgeted with her pen, clearly uncomfortable with whatever was about to unfold. Victoria Pemberton didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Gentlemen, Ms. Sinclair, thank you for agreeing to this meeting. We're here to discuss the systematic theft of $1.3 billion from the Sterling Industries pension fund through a fraudulent scheme codenamed Project Prometheus." She slid a bound presentation across the table. 47 pages of devastating evidence, distilled from weeks of investigation. "We have documented proof of securities fraud, embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud across state and international lines. The FBI and SEC would find this very interesting. However, my client is prepared to offer you an alternative to federal prosecution." Bradley's lead attorney, a sharp-featured woman from Wachtell Lipton, immediately objected. "These allegations are baseless and defamatory. Mr. Sterling has led this company with integrity and vision. Any suggestion of impropriety is simply a disgruntled former employee attempting to extort—" Victoria cut her off with a raised hand. Page 12. Email from Bradley Sterling to Connor Ashford, dated March 15, 2018. Quote, "Move another $75 million through Prometheus before the quarterly audit. The sheep won't notice if we shear them slowly." Page 23. Wire transfer authorizations for 6 shell companies, all signed by Bradley Sterling at 3 a.m. on consecutive Sundays. Page 35. Payments totaling $50 million to Blake Donovan for consulting services, despite Mr. Donovan having no professional qualifications beyond being Mr. Sterling's romantic partner. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Margaret Sinclair's face had gone pale, while Connor Ashford's expression remained studiously blank. Bradley himself had developed a fascinating tic in his left eye. "You're fishing," he said, his voice steady despite the mounting evidence. "Corporate consulting arrangements are complex. Investment strategies sometimes fail. That doesn't make them criminal." Franklin spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years in these very rooms. "Bradley, I trained you when you were fresh out of Wharton. I knew your father, helped him build this company. He'd be spinning in his grave if he knew what you've done. You turned a pension fund into your personal playground, stealing from people who trusted us with their futures." Grace watched the dynamics carefully, noting how Margaret Sinclair kept glancing between Franklin and the evidence folder. The CFO knew something was wrong, had probably known for a while, but had been too frightened or compromised to act. Connor Ashford, on the other hand, radiated the dangerous confidence of a man with exit strategies and non-extradition treaties. "Even if these accusations had merit," Connor said smoothly, "proving intent in financial matters is notoriously difficult. Markets fluctuate, investments fail. Consulting relationships are matters of business judgment." Victoria smiled the way a shark might smile at a particularly plump seal. "Turn to page 41. Security footage from this very floor, showing you and Bradley accessing the secure server room at 2 a.m. on November 3, 2019. The same night that $300 million was transferred to Ashford Holdings in Grand Cayman. We have the server logs. We have the transfer records. We have everything." Bradley's composure finally cracked. "What do you want?" The question came out harsh, stripped of corporate polish. Victoria opened her briefcase and produced a single sheet of paper. "Full restitution of the stolen $1.3 billion. Your immediate resignation as CEO. Connor Ashford's resignation from the board and divestiture of all Sterling-related holdings. complete cooperation with an independent audit to ensure no ongoing fraud, and the establishment of an employee-controlled oversight committee for the pension fund going forward. She paused, letting the demands sink in. You have 48 hours to accept these terms. After that, we file criminal charges with the Department of Justice and share our evidence with the Wall Street Journal. That's extortion, Bradley's lawyer sputtered. But even she seemed to realize how hollow it sounded given the evidence on the table. Bradley himself was staring at Franklin with something between hatred and bewilderment. You spent 2 years pretending to be homeless. 2 years sitting in that diner, playing the victim, all to set me up? Franklin's expression didn't waver. I spent 2 years documenting the real victims of your greed. Grace here can tell you about them. The retirees who can't afford medication, the families torn apart by financial stress you created, the workers who gave it everything to this company only to have their futures stolen by a CEO more interested in funding his boyfriend's mansion collection than honoring our obligations. The mention of Blake Donovan hit like a physical blow. Bradley's face flushed dark red, and Grace saw Connor Ashford's hand move subtly toward his phone. Don't, Victoria warned. Any attempt to move assets or destroy evidence will be met with immediate injunctions. We've already notified the relevant authorities to monitor your accounts. Margaret Sinclair suddenly spoke up, her voice shaky but determined. I want immunity. Everyone turned to look at her. I know about Prometheus. Bradley made me sign off on transfers I knew were questionable. He said the board had approved everything, that it was above my pay grade to question investment strategies. But I kept copies of everything. Everything. The room erupted. Bradley's lawyer was shouting about attorney-client privilege, while Connor Ashford was already standing to leave. Victoria remained calm in the chaos, her voice cutting through the noise. Miss Sinclair, we would be very interested in discussing your cooperation. As for the rest of you, the clock is ticking. 48 hours to return what you stole or face the consequences. And gentlemen, the FBI has been notified about potential flight risks. I wouldn't recommend any impromptu international vacations. Bradley stood slowly, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. You think you've won? You have no idea who you're dealing with. I have resources you can't imagine, connections at every level of government and finance. You're a washed-up has-been and a waitress playing detective. I'll bury you both. Grace found herself standing as well, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Mr. Sterling, I serve breakfast to the people you stole from every single morning. I see their faces when they count change to afford coffee. I watch them pretend everything's fine when their whole world is falling apart because of what you did. You're right. I'm just a waitress. But I'm a waitress who knows the truth, and now everyone else will too. The standoff lasted another heartbeat before Connor Ashford moved toward the door. Bradley, we should discuss this privately. The undertone was clear. They needed to plan their response, possibly their escape. Victoria let them go, but nodded to one of her associates, who immediately pulled out his phone. Within minutes, there would be surveillance on both men, ensuring they couldn't flee or hide assets. Margaret Sinclair remained seated, her hands folded on the table. I have documentation going back 3 years, she said quietly. Not just financial records. Recordings of meetings where Bradley discussed the scheme. I thought I was protecting myself. But really, I was just too scared to do the right thing. I want to help fix this. As they left the Sterling building, Grace felt the weight of what they'd just done settling on her shoulders. They'd thrown down the gauntlet to one of the most powerful men in New Jersey, backed by nothing but truth and the hope that justice still meant something in America. Franklin walked beside her, looking older but somehow lighter, as if confronting Bradley had lifted a weight he'd carried for too long. You were magnificent in there, he said. When you stood up to him, reminded him of the real cost of his crimes. That's what will resonate with a jury if this goes to trial. Victoria was already on her phone, coordinating with her team. Margaret Sinclair wants to meet tonight. She's scared Bradley might try to silence her. I'm putting her in a hotel with security until we can depose her properly. David, I need you to start freezing any accounts we can touch. Sarah, coordinate with the forensic team to preserve all electronic evidence. If Bradley's going to fight dirty, we need to be ready. She paused, looking at Grace and Franklin. You both should consider security as well. Bradley Sterling didn't accumulate $1 billion by playing nice when cornered. Grace thought about her small apartment above the grocery store, her mother still recovering from chemo, Michael away at Princeton. "I can't afford bodyguards," she said simply. Franklin put a hand on her shoulder. "You won't need to. I've already arranged for discreet protection for you and your family. These are men I served with, men I trust. Bradley Sterling won't get within 100 yards of anyone you care about." The casual way he said it reminded Grace that Franklin Westbrook had been far more than just a CFO. The 82nd Airborne tattoo on his arm represented a brotherhood that corporate criminals couldn't buy or intimidate. As they parted ways, Victoria heading to secure Margaret Sinclair and Franklin to coordinate with his security contacts, Grace found herself alone on the streets of Manhattan. The city bustled around her, oblivious to the financial nuclear bomb they just detonated in a 47th floor boardroom. In 48 hours, Bradley Sterling would either capitulate or declare war. Either way, Grace Caldwell's simple life as a waitress was over. She'd entered a world where billion-dollar fortunes hung in the balance, where powerful men destroyed lives with spreadsheet entries, and where justice required more courage than she'd ever imagined possessing. But as she headed for the subway back to Newark, Grace felt no regret. Those pension funds belonged to her customers, her community, her people. And if Bradley Sterling thought a waitress from Newark would back down from a fight for what was right, he was about to learn just how wrong wealth and privilege had made him. The leak hit the Newark Star-Ledger's website at 6 a.m. Tuesday morning, just as Bradley Sterling's 48-hour deadline expired. "Sterling Industries CEO accused of billion-dollar pension fraud," screamed across the homepage, accompanied by a photo of Bradley at a charity gala, champagne in hand, diamonds glittering on his cufflinks. Grace read the article on her phone while opening Rosie's Diner, her hands trembling slightly as she recognized quotes from their evidence. Someone, probably Margaret Sinclair, had given the newspaper enough to run the story, but not enough to compromise the legal case. Within an hour, the story had been picked up by Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, and CNBC. By the time the breakfast rush started, every customer was talking about it. "Always knew that company was rotten," growled Pete, stirring sugar into his coffee. "My brother worked there 35 years. Last year they told him his pension was being restructured for sustainability. Now we know where the money really went." Grace refilled his cup, biting her tongue to keep from revealing her role in exposing the fraud. Around her, the diner buzzed with anger and vindication. These were the people Bradley Sterling had dismissed as sheep to be sheared, and they were discovering just how badly they'd been fleeced. When her phone rang with Victoria's number, Grace stepped into the kitchen to answer. "Emergency meeting at the New Jersey Division of Pension and Benefits. They're convening a special hearing. Bradley's team filed for an injunction against our evidence, claiming it was illegally obtained. We need you there by noon." The government building in Trenton was a stark contrast to Sterling's gleaming headquarters. Worn linoleum floors, flickering fluorescent lights, and the persistent smell of burnt coffee. But the hearing room was packed with reporters, Sterling employees, and retirees who'd driven from across the state to witness the confrontation. Grace took her seat behind Victoria and Franklin, trying to ignore the cameras pointed in their direction. Across the aisle, Bradley Sterling sat with a phalanx of lawyers from Wachtell Lipton, their hourly rate probably exceeding what most people in the room made in a month. Connor Ashford was conspicuously absent, though Grace noticed federal marshals stationed at the exits. Apparently, someone was taking the flight risk seriously. The hearing commissioner, Judge Patricia Walsh, called for order with the weary efficiency of someone who'd overseen too many corporate scandals. "This emergency session has been convened to address allegations of systematic fraud within the Sterling Industries Pension Fund. Mr. Sterling, your attorneys have filed a motion to suppress evidence, claiming it was obtained through corporate espionage. Please present your argument." Bradley's lead attorney, the sharp-featured woman from their boardroom confrontation, stood with practiced confidence. "Your Honor, Franklin Westbrook engaged in a 2-year campaign of deception, posing as a homeless person to infiltrate Sterling Industries and steal confidential information. Any evidence obtained through this charade should be inadmissible. Furthermore, we question Mr. Westbrook's mental competency. What rational person pretends to be homeless for 2 years? Victoria rose before the attorney could continue. Your Honor, Mr. Westbrook was conducting a legitimate investigation into financial crimes that affected thousands of New Jersey residents. He didn't steal anything. Every document we've presented was either publicly available, obtained during his tenure as CFO, or provided by whistleblowers within Sterling Industries who were concerned about illegal activities. As for his mental competency, I'd argue that spending 2 years documenting corporate fraud shows exceptional dedication to justice, not mental instability. She paused, gesturing to the packed gallery. The real question is why Mr. Sterling is more concerned about how we obtained evidence than addressing whether he stole $1.3 billion from his employees' retirement funds. Judge Walsh reviewed the motion with obvious skepticism. Mr. Sterling, I'm inclined to agree with the plaintiffs. If Mr. Westbrook had broken into your offices or hacked your computers, that would be one thing. But conducting personal observation from a public diner and accepting documents from willing whistleblowers doesn't constitute corporate espionage. Motion denied. Now, let's address the substance of these allegations. Grace watched Bradley's face darken as his legal strategy crumbled. His lawyers huddled, whispering urgently, while Margaret Sinclair entered the room under federal protection, carrying boxes of documents that made Bradley visibly flinch. The plaintiffs may call their first witness, Judge Walsh announced. Franklin stood, adjusting his tie, and walked to the witness stand with military precision. For the next hour, he methodically laid out the architecture of Project Prometheus, using a presentation that transformed complex financial fraud into a story anyone could understand. He showed how consulting fees to shell companies had drained the pension fund, how investment losses were actually transfers to offshore accounts, how Bradley Sterling had personally approved every fraudulent transaction, often in the middle of the night to avoid oversight. The reporters scribbled frantically while the retirees in the gallery sat in stunned silence, finally understanding how their futures had been stolen. Mr. Westbrook, Bradley's attorney began her cross-examination. Isn't it true that you were forced to resign from Sterling Industries due to performance concerns? Franklin's smile was razor-sharp. I was forced to resign because I discovered Mr. Sterling was stealing from the pension fund. When I confronted him, he gave me a choice: leave quietly or face fabricated embezzlement charges. I chose a third option: gathering evidence to protect the 5,000 families whose retirements were being plundered. The attorney tried another angle. You spent 2 years living as a homeless person. Doesn't that suggest some form of mental break? Franklin's voice hardened. I spent 2 years observing the human cost of corporate greed. Every morning I watched Sterling employees count pennies for coffee because their promised pensions had mysteriously shrunk. That's not mental illness, counselor. That's bearing witness. Grace was called next, and she could feel Bradley's eyes boring into her as she took the stand. Victoria guided her through her testimony, the daily struggles of Sterling retirees she served, Franklin's meticulous note-taking, the moment she discovered his true identity. But it was during cross-examination that Grace found her voice. Ms. Caldwell, Bradley's attorney said with barely concealed disdain, you're a waitress with no financial training. How could you possibly understand the complexities of pension fund management? Grace straightened in her chair. I understand that Maria Santos had to choose between her heart medication and her rent payment last month. I understand that Tom Bradley, no relation to your client, worked at Sterling for 42 years and now eats 1 meal a day to stretch his pension check. I may not have an MBA, but I can do basic math. When billions disappear and thousands suffer, that's not complex finance. That's theft. The room erupted in murmurs of agreement from the gallery. Judge Walsh gavelled for order, but Grace caught the slight nod of approval she gave. Margaret Sinclair's testimony came next, and it was devastating. The current CFO had brought receipts, literally. She presented emails where Bradley discussed maximizing Prometheus extraction, and keeping the sheep calm while we shear them. She played audio recordings from her phone of Bradley instructing her to approve payments to Blake Donovan's shell companies. Most damning, she revealed that Bradley had already moved $500 million to accounts in countries without extradition treaties. "He knew this day would come," Margaret said, her voice steady despite visible fear. "He's been planning his exit strategy since the first Prometheus payment." The forensic accountants presented their findings with clinical precision. Charts showed money flowing from pension funds through shell companies to offshore accounts. They'd traced luxury purchases: Blake Donovan's $50 million estate, a yacht registered in the Bahamas, art purchases totaling $30 million, all paid for with pension fund money. David Chen delivered the killing blow. "In total, we've documented $1.3 billion in fraudulent transfers. At current estimates, this affects the retirement security of 5,342 sterling employees and retirees. The average loss per person is $244,000. For many, their entire retirement savings." Bradley's lawyers made one last desperate play. "Your Honor, even if financial irregularities occurred, Mr. Sterling cannot be held solely responsible for investment decisions made by a team of advisors." Victoria stood for her rebuttal, holding a single piece of paper. "This is a memo from Mr. Sterling to Connor Ashford, dated 6 months ago. Quote, 'The beauty of Prometheus is that I control every aspect. The board sees what I want them to see. Margaret signs what I tell her to sign, and our friend Blake ensures the offshore component remains invisible. By the time anyone figures it out, we'll be untouchable.'" End quote. She looked directly at Bradley. "Does that sound like team decision-making to you?" Judge Walsh had heard enough. "Based on the evidence presented, I'm recommending immediate federal investigation into Sterling Industries' pension fund management. I'm also ordering a freeze on all company and personal assets related to the named parties pending a full forensic audit. Mr. Sterling, Mr. Ashford, and Mr. Donovan are prohibited from leaving the state of New Jersey until this matter is resolved." She turned to the gallery full of retirees and employees. "To those affected by this alleged fraud, the state will do everything in its power to recover your stolen funds. Justice may be delayed, but it will not be denied." As Bradley Sterling was escorted out by federal marshals, he paused near Grace. "You think you've won?" he hissed. "You've destroyed a company that employed thousands. Those jobs will disappear because of your meddling." Grace met his gaze steadily. "Sterling Industries will survive without you. It survived before you turned it into your personal ATM, and it'll thrive once honest leadership returns. The only thing destroyed today was your ability to steal from people who trusted you." Bradley's face contorted with rage, but the marshals moved him along before he could respond. As she watched him disappear into federal custody, Grace felt no triumph, only relief. The battle was won, but the war for justice had just begun. Outside the building, reporters swarmed, but Grace let Victoria and Franklin handle the questions. She stood apart, watching Sterling employees and retirees embrace, some crying with relief, others with anger finally validated. Eleanor Bradshaw found her in the crowd, tears streaming down her weathered face. "You did it," she whispered, hugging Grace fiercely. "You actually did it. Maybe now I can sleep at night, knowing I'm not sending denial letters to people who earn their benefits." As the crowd began to disperse, Grace's phone buzzed with a text from her brother Michael. "Saw the news. I'm so proud of you, sis. Dad would be too." Grace smiled, thinking of her father, who'd worked his whole life believing in the promise of a secure retirement. Today, she'd helped protect that promise for thousands of others. It wasn't the life she'd planned when she put on her apron each morning at Rosie's diner, but maybe that's what made it matter. Sometimes heroes wore capes. Sometimes they wore sensible shoes and served coffee to people whose lives hung in the balance of corporate greed and individual courage. The settlement negotiations took place in a federal courthouse in Newark, 3 months after the explosive hearing that had sent Bradley Sterling to federal detention. Grace sat with Victoria's legal team. still somewhat amazed to be included in discussions involving amounts of money she could barely comprehend. Across the massive conference table, Bradley's new legal team. He'd fired Wachtell Lipton after they'd failed to suppress the evidence, presented their opening position. Bradley himself appeared via video link from the Metropolitan Detention Center, orange jumpsuit replacing his Armani suits, his former swagger reduced to sullen compliance. The federal prosecutor, James Davidson, had made it clear: cooperate fully or face 25 years for securities fraud, wire fraud, and embezzlement. My client is prepared to return $800 million, Bradley's new attorney announced, as if this were a generous concession. Victoria actually laughed. $800 million? Your client stole $1.3 billion. We have forensic accounting proving every penny. Mr. Sterling can either return the full amount or explain to a jury why he thought his boyfriend needed a $50 million mansion. More than 5,000 employees needed their retirement security. The mention of Blake Donovan, who'd been arrested trying to flee to Switzerland, made Bradley flinch even through the video screen. The federal prosecutor added his weight. Ms. Pemberton is correct. Full restitution is non-negotiable. The only question is whether Mr. Sterling provides it voluntarily or whether we seize every asset he's ever touched. The negotiations revealed the stunning scope of Bradley's theft. Properties in New York, Miami, Aspen, and the Hamptons. Art collections worth $60 million. Offshore accounts in 7 countries. Classic cars, yachts, even a small aircraft. Blake Donovan's assets added another $100 million to the recovery pool. Connor Ashford, arrested at Miami International Airport with a suitcase full of cash and negotiable bonds, had already agreed to return $200 million in exchange for a reduced sentence. Here's what's going to happen, Judge Patricia Walsh announced after reviewing the asset lists. Every property will be liquidated. Every account will be emptied. Every luxury item will be auctioned. The proceeds will go directly into a court-supervised trust for distribution to the affected employees and retirees. Grace watched Margaret Sinclair present the restoration plan she'd developed with Franklin and the forensic accountants. The CFO had thrown herself into redemption with the same attention to detail she'd once used to enable Bradley's crimes. We've identified every affected pension account, she explained, pulling up a comprehensive spreadsheet. Using the recovered funds, we can restore approximately 92% of what was stolen. It's not perfect, but combined with interest and penalty payments, most retirees will be made whole within 18 months. The room stirred with cautious optimism. 92% was better than anyone had dared hope when the fraud was first exposed. Franklin presented the governance reforms that would prevent future theft. Sterling Industries will implement a new oversight structure. The pension fund will be managed by an independent board with employee representation. No single executive will have unilateral authority over fund transfers. All investments will require multiple approvals and external audits. We're also establishing a whistleblower protection program with significant financial incentives for reporting suspected fraud. His presentation was interrupted by applause from the Sterling employees who'd been permitted to observe the proceedings. These weren't just policy changes. They were shields against future Bradley Sterlings who might view worker retirements as their personal piggy banks. Bradley's resistance crumbled as the reality of his situation sank in. His attorney read a prepared statement. Mr. Sterling agrees to full restitution of $1.3 billion through liquidation of all personal and corporate assets tied to the fraudulent scheme. He further agrees to cooperate with authorities in recovering funds hidden by co-conspirators. The video feed showed Bradley signing document after document, each signature returning stolen money to its rightful owners. When he reached the deed for Blake Donovan's Greenwich estate, his hand trembled. That palace built on stolen dreams would be sold, its proceeds distributed among the thousands he'd robbed. The human impact of the restoration became clear as Grace helped coordinate the notification process. She worked with Eleanor Bradshaw to personally call retirees who'd been hit hardest by the fraud. Mrs. Santos, this is Grace Caldwell from the Sterling Pension Recovery Team. I'm calling to inform you that your full pension will be restored within 90 days. The silence on the other end lasted so long Grace thought they'd been disconnected. Then came the sobbing, deep, cathartic tears of relief. "I can keep my house," Maria Santos whispered. "I can help my daughter finish college. Oh, Grace, I thought we'd lost everything." Call after call brought similar reactions. Disbelief giving way to joy, fear replaced by hope. The corporate restructuring moved with surprising speed. Sterling's board of directors, facing shareholder lawsuits and public outrage, accepted Franklin's reform proposals without modification. They appointed him as interim CEO with a mandate to rebuild trust and stability. His first act was to promote Grace to Director of Employee Advocacy, a new position designed to ensure worker voices were heard in corporate decisions. "You've shown more understanding of our employees' needs than any MBA could provide," he told her in the same boardroom where they'd confronted Bradley months earlier. "This company needs leaders who remember that every decision affects real people with real lives." Grace's new role came with a salary of $95,000, more than she'd ever dreamed of making. But more importantly, it came with the power to make a difference. She established employee resource centers at each Sterling facility, staffed with counselors who could help workers understand their benefits and plan for retirement. She instituted regular town halls where employees could directly question leadership about financial decisions. Most symbolically, she convinced Franklin to convert the executive dining room into an all-employee cafe where factory workers and C-suite executives would eat side by side, breaking down the barriers Bradley had used to isolate himself from the people he was robbing. The quarterly report following the reforms showed remarkable results. While profits dipped 15% due to increased pension contributions and the costs of restructuring, employee satisfaction scores soared to 70%, the highest in company history. Productivity increased as workers who'd been planning to leave decided to stay, believing once again in Sterling's future. The stock price, which had plummeted during the scandal, began a steady recovery as investors recognized that ethical management could be profitable management. "Turns out," Franklin observed during a board meeting, "people work harder when they trust their employer isn't stealing from them." The criminal proceedings moved forward in parallel with the corporate restoration. Bradley Sterling pled guilty to 15 counts of fraud and received a sentence of 8 to 10 years in federal prison. Blake Donovan, his assets liquidated and his high society life destroyed, received 5 years for money laundering. Connor Ashford, who'd cooperated extensively with prosecutors, got 3 years and would likely serve 18 months. But for Grace, the real victory wasn't in the prison sentences. It was in the faces of Sterling employees who could retire with dignity, in the young workers who could trust their pension contributions would be there decades later, in the transformation of a poisoned corporate culture into something healthier. The Restoration Fund disbursements began 6 months after the settlement. Grace stood with Franklin and Victoria as they presented the first restored pension check to Tom Bradley, the retiree who'd been eating 1 meal a day to survive. The check for $248,000, his full stolen pension plus interest, trembled in his weathered hands. "I can live again," he said simply, tears rolling down his cheeks. "I can visit my grandchildren in California. I can turn the heat on in winter. I can live like a person again." Cameras captured the moment, but Grace saw beyond the media event to the human truth. Justice delayed, but not denied. Trust broken, but slowly rebuilding. Margaret Sinclair, granted immunity in exchange for her cooperation, threw herself into implementing the new financial controls with an almost religious fervor. "I was a coward," she told Grace during one of their late-night working sessions. "I knew something was wrong, but convinced myself it wasn't my responsibility. Never again. Every pension check that goes out now represents a promise I'm personally guaranteeing." Her transformation from enabler to protector became a model for other Sterling executives who'd looked the other way during Bradley's reign. The culture of complicity was being replaced, slowly but steadily, by a culture of accountability. As the 1-year anniversary of the fraud's exposure approached, Sterling Industries published a transparency report that would have been unthinkable under Bradley's leadership. Every pension fund investment was detailed, Every executive compensation package was disclosed. Every dollar could be traced from contribution to distribution. The report's foreword, written jointly by Franklin and Grace, read in part, "Trust, once broken, must be rebuilt through actions, not words. Sterling Industries is committed to proving every day that we deserve the faith our employees place in us. Their retirements are not numbers on a spreadsheet, but promises we're honored to keep." The transformation wasn't perfect. Some employees never recovered their full losses. Some retirees had died during the years their pensions were stolen, their final days shadowed by unnecessary poverty. The Sterling Industries that emerged from the scandal was leaner, more cautious, forever marked by the betrayal of its leadership. But it was also more humane, more connected to its workforce, more aware that corporate success meant nothing if it came at the cost of employee security. Grace often thought about the journey from that morning when Franklin first shuffled into Rosie's diner to the boardroom where she now helped set policy for thousands of workers. It seemed impossible, like something from a movie rather than real life. But the restored pension checks were real. The reformed corporate culture was real. The justice, imperfect but substantial, was real. And that was enough to keep fighting for. 18 months after Bradley Sterling's conviction, Grace Caldwell stood in the morning darkness outside Rosie's diner, keys in hand. The familiar weight of them felt different now. She was no longer just an employee, but a co-owner, Franklin having insisted she accept a 50% stake as part of their partnership. The April dawn was crisp and clear, nothing like that morning when a black Bentley had shattered her ordinary world. She unlocked the door and flipped on the lights, smiling at the renovations they'd completed. The worn linoleum had been replaced, the booths reupholstered, and a new kitchen installed. But they'd kept the checkered pattern, the chrome fixtures, and, most importantly, the soul of the place that had served Newark's working class for 60 years. The first pot of coffee was brewing when Eleanor Bradshaw arrived, earlier than the official 5:30 opening. Couldn't sleep, she admitted, settling into what had once been Franklin's corner booth. Today felt too important to waste on sleeping. Grace understood completely. Today marked the grand opening of the Rosie's Community Kitchen, funded by the Sterling Foundation that Franklin had established with his own recovered assets. 200 free meals would be served daily to anyone who needed them. No questions asked, no judgment passed. It was Franklin's way of honoring the kindness he'd received during his investigation, and Grace's way of ensuring no one in their community would go hungry while fighting their own battles against corporate indifference. By 6 a.m., a line had formed outside, not just those seeking free meals, but Sterling employees wanting to support the initiative. Tom Bradley was first through the door, looking healthier than Grace had seen him in years. "Figured I owed you breakfast after all those you gave me," he said, pressing a $100 bill into the donation jar they'd set up for those who could afford to pay it forward. Maria Santos arrived next with her daughter, who had graduated from Rutgers debt-free thanks to the restored pension funds. The morning rush became a reunion of sorts, survivors of corporate greed gathering to celebrate resilience and renewal. Franklin arrived at 7 sharp, punctual as always, but moving more slowly than he used to. The stress of rebuilding Sterling Industries had aged him, though he wore it with dignity. He still carried that oak box, but Grace knew its contents had changed. Gone were the USB drives and evidence files. Now it held photos of his late wife Margaret, letters from employees thanking him for saving their retirements, and a new addition, a picture of him and Grace from the day they'd signed the partnership papers for the diner. "Good morning, partner," he said with that formal courtesy that would never change. "Shall we serve some breakfast?" The morning flowed with practiced rhythm, though Grace now moved between the dining room and the office where she managed the diner's books alongside her continuing work with Sterling Industries. She'd kept the employee advocacy position but reduced her hours, splitting time between corporate reform and community service. It was exhausting but fulfilling in ways her old life had never been. When Michael arrived from Princeton, where he was finishing his law degree with a focus on financial crimes prosecution, the family circle felt complete. Dad would be so proud, he said, hugging her between coffee refills. You didn't just save Sterling's employees. You showed everyone that ordinary people can fight back against corporate power and win. Around 10 a.m., a surprise visitor arrived. Margaret Sinclair, looking nervous but determined. The former CFO had left Sterling after the reforms were implemented, taking a teaching position at Rutgers Business School, where she used the scandal as a case study in ethical failure and redemption. I wanted to thank you, she told Grace quietly, for giving me the chance to make things right, for believing people could change. She'd brought a check for $50,000 for the community kitchen, but more importantly, she'd brought 3 of her graduate students who wanted to volunteer. They're studying corporate social responsibility, she explained. I thought they should see what it actually looks like in practice. The lunch rush brought unexpected media attention. A documentary filmmaker who'd been following the Sterling scandal wanted to interview Grace about the transformation from waitress to corporate reformer to social entrepreneur. What drove you to risk everything? The filmmaker asked, her camera capturing the bustling diner full of people from every economic stratum sharing meals and conversation. Grace thought carefully before answering. I didn't see it as risking everything. I saw it as protecting everything that mattered. Community, dignity, the belief that work should be rewarded with security. Bradley Sterling thought people like us were sheep to be sheared. He forgot that sheep can become shepherds when necessity demands it. The afternoon brought a delegation from Sterling Industries' new Employee Oversight Board. They met in the back office that had once stored only supplies, but now served as an impromptu conference room for the various community initiatives Grace and Franklin had launched. The pension fund had recovered to pre-fraud levels, they reported, and the new governance structure was being studied by other corporations as a model for preventing executive malfeasance. We've had inquiries from employees at 12 other companies, the board chair explained. They want to know how we transformed Sterling from a culture of exploitation to one of mutual respect. We tell them it started with a waitress who wouldn't let injustice stand. As the day wound down, Grace found herself in the kitchen with Franklin, preparing the evening meal service. They worked in comfortable silence, the partnership that had begun with small acts of kindness having evolved into something deeper. A shared mission to prove that business could be both profitable and humane. You know what I've learned, Franklin said, seasoning a pot of soup with the same precision he'd once applied to financial reports. Money isn't the root of all evil. The worship of money above human dignity, that's where evil takes root. Bradley never understood that. He thought wealth was the only measure of success. The dinner service brought a final surprise visitor. A young woman approached Grace hesitantly, holding an envelope. You don't know me, she began. But my father worked at Sterling for 30 years. When the pension was restored, he was able to keep our family home. He died last month, but he wanted me to give you this. The envelope contained a handwritten letter and a small wooden angel. The letter read, Grace, you probably don't remember serving me breakfast all those mornings when I was counting pennies and facing foreclosure. But I remember your kindness, your smile, the extra food you'd slip onto my plate when you thought I wasn't looking. That kindness kept me going when Bradley Sterling's greed nearly broke me. This angel was my wife's. She always said angels come in many forms. Thank you for being ours. As closing time approached, Grace stood in the doorway, watching the last of the evening's diners finish their meals. The community kitchen had served 237 free meals on its first day, with dozens more paying customers contributing to sustain the program. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There were still Sterling retirees struggling with partial pension restoration, still companies across America where executives viewed worker benefits as optional expenses rather than sacred obligations. But tonight, in this diner where justice had begun with a cup of coffee and a sandwich, hope felt tangible. Franklin joined her at the door, that weathered oak box tucked under his arm. I have something for you, Q, he said, his voice unusually emotional. He opened the box and withdrew a yellowed envelope. This was Margaret's, my Margaret. She wrote it during her final days when she knew she was leaving me. I've carried it for 60 years, but I think it's time it found a new home. Grace opened the letter with trembling hands. The elegant script read, "My darling, when I'm gone, remember that love isn't measured in years but in actions. Every kindness you show, every justice you seek, every person you lift up, that's my love living on through you. Don't mourn what we're losing. Celebrate what we've built and keep building it for others." Grace felt tears on her cheeks as she carefully refolded the letter.
"Franklin, I can't accept this. It's too precious."
But he pressed it back into her hand along with the box itself. "Margaret would have loved you," he said simply. "She would have seen in you what I saw that first morning you gave a supposedly homeless man dignity along with breakfast. This box has carried my past for too long. Now let it carry hope for the future, yours and everyone you'll help in the years to come." Grace accepted the box, understanding that she was receiving not just wood and memories, but a legacy of service that stretched back generations. They closed the diner together, turning off lights and checking locks with the ritual precision of people who understood that small acts done well could change the world. Outside, Newark's great streets were quieter than usual, as if the city itself was acknowledging the significance of what had been accomplished within these walls. "Same time tomorrow?" Franklin asked with a slight smile, the same words he'd used during those 2 years of investigation. "Same time tomorrow," Grace confirmed, clutching the oak box that now held her own treasures, the letter from the retiree's daughter, photos from the restoration celebration, the partnership papers for the diner, and now Margaret Westbrook's final message about love lived through action. As they parted ways, Franklin heading to his restored home and Grace to her apartment where her mother was now cancer-free and Michael was visiting for the week, she thought about circles and how they close. 2 years ago, she'd been a waitress struggling to make ends meet, serving coffee to a mysterious old man with sad eyes and careful manners. Now she was a business owner, a corporate reformer, a community leader, but still, at heart, someone who believed in the power of kindness to change lives. The oak box under her arm was proof that sometimes the smallest gestures created the biggest ripples, that ordinary people could topple giants, that justice delayed didn't have to mean justice denied. The last thing Grace did before bed was place the oak box on the shelf behind the counter at Rosie's, right next to her mother's photo and the framed first dollar from their community kitchen. Tomorrow she'd wake before dawn, brew the first pot of coffee, and serve breakfast to whoever walked through their doors, executives and construction workers, retirees and students, the secure and the struggling. She'd continue fighting for corporate accountability at Sterling Industries while building something beautiful and necessary in her community. And always, she'd remember that moment when Franklin Westbrook first shuffled through their door, reminding her that angels came in many forms and that kindness, offered freely and without expectation, could unlock doors that power and wealth could never open. In the end, that was the greatest dividend of all, not the money recovered or the criminals jailed, but the proof that goodness, stubbornly maintained in the face of greed, could transform the world one breakfast at a time.